Recently, I found myself using the context API a lot more in my applications, definitely much more than I used to do so in the past. Usually, I would only typically use the context API for something like an auth provider or a theme provider, but now it's different. Now I have a very specific use case that is a perfect fit for the context provider, and I wanted to talk about it in this video. I want to talk about it because I definitely think that it's worth you learning and even applying into your own applications, and also use this as a kind of an opportunity to talk about the context API in general, and also see when is the right time to use it versus when is the wrong time to use it. Alright, so over here, I created a very typical and also very simple example of creating and exporting a context using the context API from React. So first, over here, we're defining the type of the value of our context. So what is our context going to hold? What can we use from it? In this case, we have value A and value B, both of which are going to be strings. Then we're going to create the context using the create context function directly from React. That is going to give us here this example context, which we can then use to actually plug it and provide it to our application. All of this happens and is managed by this example provider component. So this is a React component, right? It receives the children as props, which are going to be your other components, your potential consumers of this context. And then here, we're going to define and actually hold and manage our actual values of the context. So value A and value B. And then we're going to provide it to the rest of our children through the value prop of the example context. And then, of course, over here, we have a custom hook that basically accesses this context here. So we're using the use hook from React 19 to actually get the context over here, throw an error if we don't have a context, and then just return it. And this is what we're going to basically use in our consumers to actually use and consume this context. And over here, in this app component here, we have an example of how you would typically use this, right? So here we have an app component. We're calling the example provider component. We're wrapping everything with it. And then we have this example component, which is going to be a consumer of the context. And here we're using the use example context hook. We're accessing value A or value B, in this case value A, and then we're just going to display the value A and do pretty much whatever we want with it, right? So I mean, this is simple stuff, right? This shouldn't really surprise anyone. This is kind of the simplest way that you can actually have a provider and a consumer in your React applications, and this is what it would look like with all of the different pieces involved. Now, here's the very important thing that you need to know about the context API. So here in this example component, we're accessing the value A over here. We would reasonably expect that whenever value A changes inside of this provider over here, right, because this is a state variable, it can change. Whenever value A changes, we would expect this example component, because it's using that value A, we would expect it to re-render so that we can get directly the updated value of value A. And that's a good assumption to make because that's exactly what happens. However, the thing that's not so obvious is that if you go back here to this example provider here we have value B, right, which is also being provided to the context through this value prop over here. If value B changes, this component over here, this example component, is still going to re-render even though it's not using value B directly. And this is very important because that's a fundamental property of the context in React, right? So just by looking at this, it's not obvious because here we're only using value A, right? We're not seeing anything with value B. If you're a new developer, you haven't really looked at this example provider here, you have no idea about it, you see value A, you would expect this component only to re-render if value A changes. But that's not how this works. That's not how the context API works. Anything that the context holds over here that re-renders is going to cause every single component that is using that context to re-render, even if they're not using the specific value that has changed. And that's why generally you should not use the context API as a global state management solution, because if you do this a lot, your components are going to re-render unnecessarily, and that is going to hurt your performance a lot. Right, so that's one of the wrong ways to use the context API. A right way to use it is to use it for things that don't really change or re-render all that often. For example, like I talked about in the beginning of the video, a theme provider, right? You have a theme provider where you want to have light, dark, or whatever else theme you want to have. That doesn't really change very often, so it's fine to put it in a context because anyways, whenever you change the theme of the application, you typically want most of your components to also re-render. But even if you don't, that change doesn't really happen all that often, so it's okay and it's worth it and it makes sense to use a context API, a context provider, to handle that piece of data. Another great example is an auth provider, right? A component that manages the authentication state of their user. Are they logged in? Are they not logged in? That's also something that doesn't change all that often, right? A user goes to your application, they log in, right? You update the state. Usually you would want to re-render a lot of components, especially the ones that depend on the user status. And then the user uses the application, their status doesn't really change. When they eventually log out, and if they log out because it might not happen, then you make that update again, you redirect them to somewhere else. And again, that's a great use case for the context API. Cool. So now that we kind of understand what the context API is really good for, let me show you my use case and the problem that it specifically solves for me. So here I have a bunch of components here. I have the postcard component. This is in the postcard file. And something that I've started to do quite a lot in my applications is I like to put and create a bunch of small components inside of the same file as the main component, right? In this case, postcard. And the reason I do this is because these components usually, right, at least for my specific use cases, they're not components that are meant to be reshared. They're basically subcomponents of this main postcard component here. So it makes sense for me, at least, to put these in the same file. That way, it kind of makes your components super simple. They do one thing, they follow the single responsibility principle, and they're also all in the same file over here, and it just makes everything easy. You don't have to jump between different files just to see what components are making up your main component here. And also, something that I also do quite often is I use React Query. Right, so here we have an example. I have this use post query here. This is a simple hook, right? It just has a query key over here and then just return some hard-coded mock data. It doesn't really matter that we're getting the data here hard-coded. What matters is that we're using React Query and all the ways that React Query works. So then we have this post query here. We obviously have to check for is loading, right? Because on that first render, the data is going to be undefined. Even if we're hard coding it, even if our data is already in the cache, that first render is always going to have undefined data because that is just how React Query works. And then we're checking the array here. And finally, once we have all of that, we're actually rendering our components. Now, all of these components here, they basically receive the post ID for the reason that they then use their own query, right, to get the same post and access the same data, and then here render specific subparts of that data. In this case, the header renders the title, and then the body renders the body of the actual post, right? It's pretty simple stuff, but again, it's meant to illustrate a broader example. Now, calling queries like this is actually perfectly fine and is even recommended, right? Because React Query has this concept of a global cache, right? So this post query here is not actually going to fire multiple times. It's not going to hit your backend, even though we don't have one. It's not going to hit the backend multiple times. If the data has already been fetched, which it has here, because we're guaranteeing that it is, right? Because these components aren't going to render until the data is actually fetched, then any subsequent calls to the same query with the same query key are going to hit the cache instead and not actually make a new fetch. Which is great, right? Because now you actually don't have to pass anything to props. The only thing that you need is to pass this post ID here, and then each component can run in isolation. As long as it gets a post ID, it can fetch its own data and then display the data directly, and then everything works super simply and as you would expect. Now, the issue with this approach is something that I hinted at a little bit earlier, right? Which is that first render, right? We said that in React Query, even if the data is already in cache, even if it's already been fetched, that first render is always going to have undefined as the value of our data, which means that in every component that we use this post query here or any other query, we're always going to have to check for undefined every single time. Again, that is just how React Query works, which means, well, two things, right? The first one is we have to actually check everywhere. We have to put this optional chaining over here. And the second thing is we always have to wait for an extra second re-render for the data to actually be there, right? And in some cases that could potentially cause some performance problems. Usually not, but in some cases it can. And that's unfortunate, right? Because we know that this data has already been fetched, right? We have it here at the top. We have this post query loading here. We're not rendering these components, so we know that it already has been fetched. But TypeScript doesn't know this, right? React doesn't know this. It is still going to re-render because again, that's just how it is, right? Now, there are a couple of solutions that we could do that are outside of the context API that would solve at least partially some of these problems. The first solution is going to be something that is native to React Query. Here inside of our use post query, instead of exporting a custom hook that is going to wrap the use query hook and then handle the query, export the query options instead. And in this case, we're going to export a function that receives a post ID, and then we'll create the query options because we need the post ID to actually generate the query options. This is a function that is directly coming from React Query that gets you all of the options that you can pass to use query or any other hook from React Query. And then in the post code over here, what we can do is here we can call use query directly and then pass it here the post query options with the post ID, right? So here's our query that is going to result in the same exact thing as we had before. Still have to check for loading, still have to check for error, and then we render the components here. The difference is that now inside of these components over here, we can actually use suspense query instead with the same query options over here, and use suspense query. What it's going to do is it's going to defer the actual loading and the error state outside of this component to the nearest suspense boundary. Now in this case, we don't have a suspense boundary. We actually don't need to. What this is going to result for us is it's basically going to assume that the fetch has been happened here, which it has. And here we're automatically going to get the data directly without having to wait or handle any other loading states. And the cool thing about this is that our data here is always going to be defined, right? We're no longer going to have that first undefined renderer, which means that we can directly use it in this component as we want to. This greatly improves our developer experience. Now, one of the potential drawbacks of using the solution, and it's actually why I don't quite prefer this solution, is that this component over here actually expects the data to have been fetched somewhere else outside of its own body, right? Because we're using suspense query over here, we're expecting the fetch to happen somewhere else, which in this case may actually be fine, right? Because this postcard header component here is co-located with the place that is actually handling the query, but it's not always going to be the case, right? Let's say that, for example, we decide that, hey, we actually want to reuse this component someplace else. So we take it from here, put it in its own file, export it, and now we're having more distance between this query over here and the place that is actually fetching the data. And then if wherever we're putting this component now, if that place doesn't prefetch the actual post here, then this component is actually not going to render, not going to show any loading state. It's just going to be blank until the post is actually rendered, right? Or fetched actually, which is going to be a horrible user experience, and it's going to be hard to debug because it's no longer coupled to the place that is actually doing the fetch, right? So me personally, I don't really prefer this solution, and I would rather use something else. Now, something else that you could do actually is you can come in here and instead of doing the post ID here, you can actually just give the post, right? You can do post query and pass the post query.data. And here we're just going to have to actually change our types over here. So let's do the post, and I actually don't have a post, but you can imagine that would be a post, right? We can just provide the post over here, right? And then just use the post here, right? That is another solution to this problem that we could use. And this is actually a perfectly valid solution, and sometimes I use this, right? This is perfectly fine to use. Some developers are afraid to use this because it looks like prop drilling. I mean, it is prop drilling, even though we're just passing one prop to one component. But you could imagine that if this postcard header had other subcomponents within it, which is totally reasonable, we would then also probably have to pass the post, and then we have like 2 layers deep, which, yeah, it is prop drilling. But even then, I would argue that it's fine because this remains simple enough, right? We're not passing things across multiple files, across multiple places. And if it's localized at least to the same file or like even 2 layers deep, I would still argue that sometimes it's fine and you can use this as a solution to fix this problem. There's also the argument that here we're passing the post even though we're only using the post title, which basically means we're passing more data to the component that it needs. But again, I usually never worry about these things. I generally prefer to pass more data just because it makes the developer experience better and it doesn't really hurt the performance all too much. Usually, if it does, then I change it. But for the most part, a good rule of thumb is I always try to pass whatever entity that I have as a whole. And then if I run into performance problems, then I make a change, right? But that's not what we're here for. We're here to talk about the context API, right? So all of this was context about the context API, no pun intended. So let's now look at how the context API solves this problem. So here we have another context here, and this one is pretty similar to the one that we had initially, just with a little bit more code because this one is a little bit more involved. So here we have the type of our context, and this one is the post context. It's only responsible for holding the value of an entire post, right? So it has the actual ID, the title, and the body property of a post, right? Then we're creating the context in the same way. Then we're creating a provider in the same way over here. It takes children, and then it also takes in a post ID to identify which post it should hold the context for. And then based off of that post ID here, we're calling the use post query, right? So I restored the query here inside of this custom hook over here. It's calling this custom hook. It's handling this loading state over here. It's handling the error state. And then once all of that is done, it's providing the data of the query. So the actual post as the value of the context, right? Same concept as in the initial example, but now with an actual real use case. And then the same way over here, we have a custom hook that we're exporting where we're actually getting the context, checking checking for the error, and then returning the value. This is the hook that we can now use instead of calling React query separately multiple times. So now we can go back here to our postcard component over here. And now the only thing that we have to do is just wrap the part of our React component tree that needs access to this post with the post provider. Then we just provided the post ID, which we anyways have access to from the props of this component. And now the postcard header, the postcard body no longer need any props, and they can directly access the post from the use post context custom hook, from the context directly. This simplifies things so much because now we're directly accessing that one single instance of the post that has already been fetched and stored in the context, and then we're just using it directly. We no longer have to check the React query cache. We no longer have to deal with the undefined first initial render. We no longer have to deal with knowing or expecting things to be outside of this component over here. We just call one hook, we get the data, and we access it directly over here without any other problems, right? And this solves every single problem that we had before, and it also reduces the amount of code that we can actually use. Now, if I try to take this component, this postcard header here, and put it somewhere else in the other part of the application, if I don't make sure to also wrap that part with the post provider, I'm going to get an error because that's exactly what this hook here does. If we don't have a context, it is going to throw an error. Right, so that solves that problem, right? The undefined problem, the first render undefined, doesn't exist because again, we're just not going to render anything over here until we actually have the data. So these components are now guaranteed to actually not re-render, and we can enforce this at the code level because again, you can't use this without the actual provider component. So that's a problem solved. And then we have this data over here. It's no longer optional, right? We directly access the post over here and we can just use it and only use the parts that we need inside of this component, and it makes things very, very simple, right? In 2 lines of code, right, we have 2 components and we just make up this actual component over here, this main component. Now, there's another benefit here, which is that this actually sets us up super easily to convert this into a compound component. And then instead of exporting this postcard component here that does all of this, we can actually export the individual parts over here. So the postcard header, the postcard body, and let the parent, whoever is wanting to create a postcard, let them actually define how they want to use their postcard component. If they want, they can actually take the body over here and put it above the header. If they want, they can actually remove the header altogether. It doesn't really matter. This component would be a compound component, so we can let the parent decide however they want to use it. This is a great pattern because it sets you up super nicely for any use case that you potentially have. It also sets you up so that you write simple components that are guaranteed to work and guaranteed to always have the error there. Otherwise, you're going to get a very nasty error, and it greatly improves the developer experience across the board. And this is honestly one of the best use cases for the context API in React. It's something that we call dependency injection, which is basically you're creating some dependencies over here, and then you're injecting those dependencies and you're making them available, you're providing them to a wide array of components of consumers that can access those dependencies super easily. And then with this, you can basically create multiple small context components over here, providers, right? Put them in different places in your application, and then you can just simplify your code a lot, simplify your performance quite a lot, reduce the amount of re-renders, and generally it's a superior solution to using all of the others that we talked about in this video. So there you go. Now you know this pattern. Try it out in your applications. Let me know what you think. Let me know your use case if it solves something, and let's all become better React developers. And speaking of becoming a better React developer, check out my courses. It's the first links in the description, and they go way beyond what I just talked about in this video. That's it for me. This is Cause and Solutions. I will see you next time. Ciao, ciao.